The night was cold and silent, and the sky was full of stars, but one star looked strange, and it was moving too fast, and then it fell like fire from the sky and disappeared into the dark forest near the town. No one knew what it was, but a hunter named Dale saw it with his own eyes, and he quickly took his rifle and went into the woods to see what had crashed, because he had never seen anything like that before. The trees were tall, and the wind was strong, and Dale moved slowly through the forest with careful steps, and his breath made white clouds in the air because of the cold, and soon he saw smoke rising between the trees, and a soft orange glow that looked like fire, but it was too quiet for fire. He came closer and hid behind a tree, and what he saw made him freeze. There was no fire and no spaceship like in the movies, but a broken round pod that was cracked from the side, and steam was coming out, and near it stood two strange figures. They were not like humans, and yet they looked like a mother and child, because one was tall and thin, and the other was small and shaking, and both had grayish-blue skin and big dark eyes, and they were barefoot, and their clothes were torn like old cloth, and snow was falling on them, but they did not move. The tall one looked around with fear in her eyes, and then knelt beside the small one and wrapped her arms around her, and said something in a language Dale could not understand, and then she whispered in broken English, "Please just food." She said it like a prayer, and her voice broke like she was about to cry, and her fingers were shaking, and she held the child close like she was trying to protect her from the cold, and the world. Dale could not believe what he was seeing, because this was not an enemy or a monster like people say aliens would be, but just a mother trying to save her daughter. He stepped back quietly and returned to the town, but he did not tell anyone yet, because he did not know what to say or who would believe him. The next morning, the town was talking about the light in the sky, and some said it was a meteor, and some said maybe a satellite crash, but no one thought it could be something living. Dale sat in the diner and looked around at the people laughing and eating and drinking coffee, and he thought about the two cold and hungry beings in the woods who had nothing. He remembered the mother's face, and how her hands shook, and how the child did not speak or cry, but just held onto her, and he felt something heavy in his chest like a stone. Outside, the forest was still quiet, and the broken pod was half buried in snow, and the alien mother was trying to start a small fire with broken sticks, and the little girl was sitting beside her with her arms around her knees, and she looked up at the sky again and again like she was waiting for someone or something. Mother gave her the last piece of dried food from a small silver bag and smiled weakly, and the girl took it and ate slowly, and then put her head on her mother's shoulder. Their eyes were tired and their bodies weak, and they were not here to fight or attack, but to survive. Back in town, some kids were saying they wanted to go to the forest and find the crash, but their parents told them not to and warned them to stay away because the forest is dangerous, and you never know what you might find. Dale stood outside the diner and looked toward the trees, and he knew he had to make a choice, because if no one helped them, they would not last another night. The sun was going down, and snow was falling again, and the sky was gray and heavy, and the wind was sharp like knives, and in the forest the fire had gone out. The mother held her daughter close and closed her eyes and whispered something again in her language, and the girl whispered back, and then they both looked at the last bit of light in the sky like they were hoping for a miracle, and maybe that miracle would come from a man with a kind heart and an old memory of war and loss, and how it feels to be left alone in the cold, because sometimes hope lands quietly and not with a bang, and it does not look like a hero or a ship with power. Sometimes hope is just a mother and her child asking for a warm meal. We don't trust monsters. Morning light touched the snow-covered ground as the town slowly woke up, and people stepped outside their warm homes with coffee in hand and winter coats tight around their bodies, and their breath rose like steam in the freezing air as they looked toward the forest and wondered what had fallen from the sky. Rumors moved like wind from one corner of the town to another, and some said it was just a meteor, and others believed it was a secret weapon from another country. and a few even said they saw strange shapes near the trees and glowing lights that did not belong to this earth. Inside the town hall, the mayor sat at a long wooden table with a few trusted people from the town, and maps were spread before them. And they talked in low voices while outside more people gathered to listen and whisper. Among themselves, one man named Carl stood up and spoke louder than the rest and said, "We need to go in and check, and if something is there, we should catch it before it hurts someone." And others nodded because fear had started to grow in their hearts like a dark seed. But not everyone agreed, and an old woman named Mrs. Carter said maybe they are not here to harm, and maybe they are scared and hungry, and no one listened to her because fear is always louder than kindness when the unknown stands at your door. Meanwhile, in the forest, the alien mother opened her eyes and felt pain in her body and the cold in her bones, and she looked at her daughter, who still slept with her small arms wrapped tightly around herself, and her lips were dry and her skin had lost color, and the mother knew they could not survive long like this, stood slowly and looked around for food or water, but there was nothing except snow and dead trees and broken metal from their escape pod, and the silence of Earth was heavy and strange, and it reminded her of the last day on her home planet. She remembered fire in the sky and screams and running through smoke and hiding in underground tunnels with her child, and then being told to escape alone because the enemy was coming. And they had no mercy and no face, only fire and sound and the smell of death. She had escaped with one pod and landed here on this cold planet. And now she had nothing but her child and the hope that someone on this world would show mercy in town. Dale could not stop thinking about them, and his hands shook as he held his coffee cup, and he knew he had to go back, but he also knew the town would not understand, and people were scared, and scared people make bad choices when they think monsters are hiding in the woods. At the same time, a group of boys decided to take their bikes and go see what really crashed, and they brought flashlights and phones, and one had a small knife, and they laughed and called themselves alien hunters as they rode toward the forest. The alien mother heard sounds through the trees and quickly pulled her daughter behind a rock and watched as the boys came closer and pointed lights toward the crash site and laughed when they saw the broken metal and said, "This is just junk and maybe a drone or satellite." And one boy kicked a piece and it sparked. Then they heard a small sound like breathing or movement and turned their lights toward the rock and saw a glimpse of something not human, and they froze. And the girl looked at them with wide eyes, and they saw fear, not threat, and they saw a child, not a monster. But one boy screamed and threw a rock and yelled it as a trick, and they ran back to town shouting and saying they saw aliens, and they are real, and they are hiding, and maybe they are dangerous, and maybe they will attack. And the town believed them because panic spreads faster than truth. Mayor called a meeting again, and this time more people came, and the church bells rang, and the fear in their voices was clear and loud, and they shouted about safety and families and protecting the town. And one man said, "If we do not act now, it may be too late." Only Dale stood silently near the back and thought about the look in the mother's eyes and the small body of the girl, and how they did not run or fight or scream, and how they just wanted to survive. And he felt something break inside him like a wall falling down. Night came again, and the cold grew deeper, and the alien mother held her child close and listened to the forest and felt that something had changed, and that soon they would be found. And she did not know if the ones who found them would bring food or fire. And high above the clouds, something moved in the darkness, watching, listening, waiting. Farmer with a secret past. Snow kept falling from the sky like pieces of silence covering the world in white, and the forest stood still like it was holding its breath. And in the distance, a small house stood alone with a barn and a wooden fence half broken and covered in ice. The man who lived there was known by few and visited by fewer, and most in the town called him Old Sam and thought he liked to be alone because he never came to meetings or talked much at the diner, and never smiled unless it was for a stray animal that followed him home. But Sam had eyes that had seen things, and hands that had held more than tools, and a heart that carried stories no one had heard in years, because Sam had been to places far from home and had worn a uniform and seen the world burn before he ever picked up a shovel or fed a cow. That morning Sam woke early, as always, and fed the chickens and checked the barn and walked to the edge of the woods with a tin of warm soup in one hand and a bag of old bread in the other, because he had seen something strange 2 nights ago and his sleep had not returned. Since he had seen the light in the sky and the smoke behind the trees, and had heard the stories in town and had seen the fear grow like weeds in dry soil, and while others prepared to fight or flee, he just watched and waited, because something in his bones told him the truth was different. He walked deep into the forest where no one else would go, and where silence wrapped around the trees like fog, and soon he saw the broken metal, the frozen ground, and 2 shapes hiding behind fallen logs wrapped in thin cloth and snow. The mother looked up first, and her eyes widened with fear, and she shielded the small girl behind her as Sam stood still and slowly placed the food on a rock near them and stepped back with both hands raised, showing no weapon, no threat, just tired kindness. He said nothing and waited, and the girl peeked from behind her mother and stared at the soup like it was gold, and the mother looked at him with searching eyes and then crawled forward, slowly took the food with shaking hands and whispered something he did not understand, but he knew what it meant. She gave the soup to the child first, and the girl drank slowly, carefully, like she was afraid it would disappear, and then gave the rest to her mother, who smiled weakly and looked at Sam like she wanted to speak but had no words that fit. Sam sat on a fallen tree and reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of chocolate wrapped in old paper and held it out, and the girl came forward slowly and took it with both hands like it was the first sweet thing she had ever held, and for a moment she looked like any other child in winter. The mother touched her chest, then pointed to Sam, then touched her chest again and said something soft, and he nodded even though he did not know the language, because sometimes the heart understands what the ears cannot. Sam returned every morning with food and blankets and firewood, and never brought anyone with him, and never spoke of it in town. And the mother began to speak small words in English and told him her name was Tana and her daughter was Lura, and they had come from a place far beyond the stars where peace had ended. She told him of the fire and the fear, and how they had run with nothing but each other, and how others were not so lucky. And Sam listened with eyes full of old memories, because he too had once run through smoke and fire, holding the hand of a friend who never made it home. One morning he brought a small music box and opened it near Lura, and soft notes filled the cold air, and the girl smiled for the first time, and her mother cried without sound, and Sam knew that even the smallest things can bring light to the darkest places. But time was running like water through open hands, and he could feel it, because the noise in town was louder and people were talking more, and someone said they saw tracks near the woods, and someone else said the government would come soon, and that made Sam worry. That night he stayed in the barn and watched the stars through broken boards, and remembered faces from long ago, and the sound of planes and cries, and he thought maybe the world had not changed at all, and only the faces were different, and the war never really ended in the forest. Tana held Lura close and looked at the little fire Sam had helped them build, and she whispered to the sky in her language and hoped someone was still listening, because she felt something coming, something that was not human and not kind. Far above them, hidden by clouds, a shape moved across the night sky with cold eyes and waiting silence. And below in the barn, Sam closed his eyes and whispered the name of a friend long gone, and said, "Please give me strength one more time." Government knows. The sky above the town looked calm, but far beyond the clouds, a quiet eye was watching, and its silver shell moved slowly through orbit while feeding information back to a black room where no one smiled and no one blinked, and every screen showed the same image again and again: a burst of light in the forest, a heat signature that did not match any human form, a crash that was not registered by any flight record, and a presence that made the alarms beep and soft. rhythm like a heartbeat just before fear begins inside that black room. Agent Keller stared at the screen with his jaw tight and his eyes sharp, and he said nothing for a long time, then finally picked up a secure phone and said one word: deploy, and the line went silent again. By morning, 3 black SUVs rolled into the town like shadows and parked near the diner and the school and the town hall, and men in long coats stepped out, without names, without smiles, and without greetings, and the air around them grew colder than the snow that covered the roads. Mayor came out with a forced grin and a shaky voice and asked if this was about the light in the sky, and one of the agents nodded slowly and said, "We believe there may be a threat nearby, and we would like full access to the forest and the surrounding areas, and we will need cooperation from the people." The town obeyed because uniforms speak louder than truth, and fear already lived in their hearts. And now it had a face made of silence and sunglasses and black folders, full of things not meant to be seen by regular eyes. Meanwhile, Sam woke up before sunrise and checked the barn and the forest path and saw fresh tire tracks near the edge of the woods, and knew the time was short and the world was closing in like a trap with invisible teeth. He walked quickly with a bag of food and blankets and reached the hidden spot where Tana and Laura waited, and when he arrived, Tana stood with her back straight and her arms around her child, and she said in slow English, "They are coming, are they not?" Sam nodded and handed her the food and said, "We must move soon, but I do not know where, and I do not know who to trust anymore." And Tana looked at her daughter, then at the sky, and said, "No one trusts what they fear in town." The agents set up equipment on rooftops and pointed antennas toward the forest, and watched screens that blinked with heat maps and movement and sound, and every now and then they whispered to each other in code and wrote notes in red ink. One agent named Miles walked into the diner and sat at the counter and ordered nothing, and just listened as people spoke about lights and sounds and strangers and danger, and Miles watched their faces carefully and measured their words like weights on a scale. Back at the crash site, another team of agents found the remains of the pod, half melted, half buried, and they took samples of metal and soil, and one of them touched the surface and pulled back quickly, saying, "It is still warm, and this was not made on Earth." In the forest, Laura asked her mother in their native tongue if they would die here, and Tana kissed her forehead and said, "Not if we stay strong, not if we believe in kindness, and not if there is still one soul left who remembers what mercy feels like." Sam built a small sled from old wood and rope and wrapped Laura in blankets and pulled her through the trees, while Tana walked beside them with her hand on the sled and her eyes always watching, always listening, always ready to run if the wind changed. They reached an old cabin far from the main path, a place Sam had used long ago for trapping and thinking and forgetting, and he opened the door with a heavy breath and helped them inside, and said, "We stay here for now, no one comes here, not even the deer." But they did not know that from above a small drone moved quietly between the trees and took pictures of footprints in the snow and metal wires in the earth, and one faint signal that did not belong to any human device. In the black room, Agent Keller stared at the new image on his screen and zoomed in slowly until he saw 2 figures and one small form beside them, and he tapped the screen twice and said "Alive," then pressed a button that sent orders across the country in less than a second. That night in the cabin, Laura fell asleep in her mother's arms, and Sam sat near the door with an old shotgun across his lap and a look in his eyes that only soldiers understand. And Tana whispered to him and asked, "Why are you helping us?" And Sam closed his eyes and said, "Because once someone helped me when I was no one." Outside, the snow fell harder than before, and the wind carried a sound that was not from this world. And miles away, engines roared to life and machines rolled toward the forest with lights that did not blink and questions that would not wait. The little girl speaks. The cabin stood alone like a forgotten story at the edge of the frozen forest, and inside the walls breathed with the wind, and the floor creaked under quiet footsteps, and the only sound was the soft breathing of a child who had never known peace, and a mother who had never stopped hoping. Laura opened her eyes slowly and blinked at the wooden roof above her, And for a moment, she forgot the cold and the fear, and only felt the warmth of her mother's arms around her, and the soft crackle of fire near the old stones where Sam had built a hearth from memory, not comfort. Sam sat near the window with a worn coat around his shoulders and an old photograph in his hands, and he looked at the smiling faces in that picture, like they were from another life, and maybe they were, and maybe he had died in that life and been reborn in this one, with snow and silence for company outside. The trees stood like watchers, and the sky hung heavy with more snow and more silence. And far away in town people whispered about soldiers and strangers, and the mayor spoke in careful sentences to men in black coats, who never gave their names and never showed their eyes inside the cabin. Lura turned her head toward Sam and stared at him with eyes that held more weight than any child should carry, and after a long pause, she sat up slowly and wrapped the blanket tighter, and said a word that made the room stop breathing. "Thank you." Sam looked at her without speaking, and then nodded once and said, "You are welcome, little one." And Lura looked down at her hands and said more words, this time slower and softer, like each one was made of glass. "We come not to fight, not to take, not to hurt. We only run. We only want safe and warmer." Mother looked at her with wide eyes and touched her face and whispered in their own language, and Lura nodded and kept going with broken English but strong voice. "They take our sky, they burn our home, they chase us across stars. They want all, not just land, not just power, but every dream and every voice and every breath, and we hide and we run and we cry and we lose. And now we are only two." Sam listened with his head lowered and eyes closed, and he saw fire in his mind again and heard old sounds from his past, and he knew the truth in her words, because fear always comes with fire, and it never stops once it begins. Lura stood up on the blanket and walked toward the fire and held out her small hands and said, "We do not want to die. We want to live and eat and sleep and laugh and play, but we do not know how anymore, because no one helps, no one hears her." Mother wiped her eyes and sat beside her and held her hand and said she did not know Lura could speak so clearly, and Lura said, "I listened every day, every word, every story, and I learned because I had to, because maybe words would save us if nothing else could." In town, the agents picked up movement from the trees again and sent more drones and more signals, and each ping brought them closer to the cabin and closer to the three souls who just wanted silence without fear and walls without eyes. Mayor watched the screens and asked if they would bring harm, and one agent said only if they refused to comply, and the mayor said they are just children, and the agent said, "We do not trust appearances, we trust data, and data says something powerful hides with them." In the forest, Lura stood at the door of the cabin and looked out at the snow and the wind and said softly, "They are coming soon. I feel them. I hear them in my mind like thunder that has not fallen yet." Sam loaded the old shotgun and looked at her with sadness, not fear, and said, "If they come, we will stand." And Lura said, "I do not want you to fight for me." And Sam said, "I am not fighting for you. I am standing for something I lost a long time ago." Her mother stepped outside and looked at the gray sky and felt the weight of many worlds pressing down on her shoulders and said, "Maybe we run again." And Lura said, "No more running, only standing, only truth." That night the stars did not shine, and the air felt sharp like broken glass, in the trees whispered warnings no one could understand, and far beyond the hills a convoy moved with lights and silence and purpose. Inside the cabin, Sam taught Lura how to hold the matchstick and start a fire, and she smiled for the first time, like the smile of someone who remembers what hope feels like. And Sam said that smile is the most dangerous weapon of all, because it means you are still here. And as the fire burned gently and the cabin held its breath, the little girl who had run across galaxies closed her eyes and whispered one final thing into the warm air: "We are not monsters, we are just hungry. Something worse is coming." Night covered the forest like a heavy blanket, and inside the cabin silence sat with them, like an old friend that never spoke and never left, and the fire flickered low but strong, and outside the wind carried a sound too faint for human ears, but not too faint for a mother who had listened to the dark all her life. Tana stood at the edge of the cabin doorway, her eyes scanning the sky, her body still and tense like a branch waiting to break, and Sam watched her from the corner. With hands folded over the shotgun and breath slow like someone who had lived through more than one ending, Lura slept wrapped in layers of blankets, her small hands curled into fists and her face soft again for the first time since the crash. And in her dreams, she ran through fields not fire and played under suns that did not fall from the sky like burning stones. Dana turned toward Sam and said in a voice made of ash and memory, "They are coming," and Sam nodded without asking who, because he had seen enough men with haunted eyes to know what truth looks like, even when it wears a face that no one understands. She walked to the fire and sat across from him, her fingers brushing against the heat like it was a memory, and she said softly, "They do not speak, they do not wait, they do not offer anything but silence and destruction, and when they find something they take it until nothing remains." Sam asked how far behind are they, and she said not far enough and never slow and always watching. And Sam looked at the old boards of the cabin and wondered if wood and nails and human wood could stop something that came from beyond the stars, with hunger not for food, but for final silence. In town, the agents tracked energy pulses and heat waves and movement patterns, and one of them showed Keller a strange fluctuation in the northern sky and said, "This is not from the ship. This is something else." And Keller leaned in and his lips moved, but no sound came out, only the tightening of his eyes. They brought in heavier equipment and parked machines near the edge of the forest and told the mayor to issue an emergency alert. And the mayor said, "What do I tell them?" And the agent said, "Tell them a storm is coming and pray they believe you back in the forest." Sam opened a hidden drawer beneath the floor and took out an old radio and twisted the knobs until the static began to shift, and he held the speaker close and said a name in a low voice and waited for an answer that did not come. Tina listened and asked who was that name, and Sam said an old friend who owed him a favor, and she said what kind of favor, and Sam said the kind that saves lives or ends them. That night Lura woke with a gasp and her eyes wide and her hands shaking, and she said in a voice clear and full of fear, "I saw them again, and this time they were closer, and their eyes were made of shadow, and their hands were not hands, and their mouths were open, but no sound came out." Tana held her and said, "It is only a dream," and Lura said, "No, it is a warning." And Sam looked out the window and saw no light, but felt the weight of the sky pressing down on the trees, and he knew something worse than fear was walking toward them. In quiet steps, the wind began to howl through the trees, and a strange hum moved through the ground, and animals ran from the forest in every direction, and even the air seemed to shiver as the temperature dropped, and the stars above blinked like they were trying to send a message before being swallowed. Tina placed her hand on the wooden floor and closed her eyes, and her lips moved without sound, and then she opened her eyes and said, "The earth remembers them, the earth fears them, and we must go now because the ground itself is telling me to run." Sam stood and grabbed the bag and helped Lura into her coat, and the three of them moved through the back door and into the trees without light, without noise, without a path, and only the sense that something was following just beyond their sight, just beyond the breath of the trees miles away. The agents watched their screens go black one by one, and machines shut down without warning, and radios filled with static, and every signal died in perfect silence. And one agent whispered, "This is not natural," and Keller said, "This is what they warned us about." In the distance, a low vibration began to rise, not like thunder, but like a scream buried deep underground, and the forest began to twist in shape, like shadows moving through dreams. And Sam pulled Lura close and whispered, "Stay behind me, and whatever happens, do not look back." Tana walked ahead, her eyes glowing faintly with light from her own world, and her hands raised like she was ready to push the air itself. And Lura looked up and said softly, "Will we live?" And Sam said, "Only if we keep going, only if we believe that we can." And behind them something opened in the sky, without sound, without color, and without end. The final choice, the sky was no longer dark, but glowing with something ancient and wrong, and every tree in the forest leaned away from the light. like they were trying to escape their own shadows, and the air did not move and the birds did not sing. And the snow stopped falling, as if the world was holding its breath. Taina stood in the clearing with her arms around Lura, and her eyes locked on the shape rising from the forest floor, a shape that was not fire and not machine, but something older than either, something made of hunger and silence and deep memory that stretched across galaxies. Sam stood beside them with his fingers wrapped around the shotgun, not because he believed it would help, but because it was the only thing he had. And sometimes a man needs something to hold when he cannot hold back fear and cannot change fate. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the light from above pulsed like a heartbeat that did not belong to anything living, and yet still beat strong and cruel and slow, like it had all the time in the universe to watch and wait and consummate. Taina turned to Sam and said, "There is one way to stop this." And Sam asked what kind of way, and she said, "The kind that no one survives." And Sam shook his head and said, "There must be another." And Taina said, "There is not, because this is what they always do, and only fire from within can make them sleep again." Lura held her mother's hand tightly and said, "I do not want you to go." And Taina knelt and touched her daughter's cheek and said, "You must stay alive, and you must remember, and you must tell them that we only wanted a place to rest, a place to eat, a place to dream in." Town. The agents felt the ground move and the sky flicker, and Keller shouted orders, and no one listened because the radios were dead and the screens were black and the machines were frozen. And the only thing they could do was look toward the hills and pray to whatever they believed in, that the light would go away back. In the clearing, Taina stood with her arms open and her face lifted to the sky, and she began to speak in a language that made the wind rise and the trees bend, and the shape in the sky paused and seemed to listen, like it remembered her voice from a time before time. Sam grabbed Lura and pulled her behind a fallen tree and held her as the air began to spin and crackle, and the light burned brighter than fire, but did not give heat, only pressure, only weight, only the feeling that something had opened that should have stayed closed. Taina floated from the ground, her body wrapped in light, and her voice grew louder until the trees shook and the snow turned to steam, and the shape in the sky began to twist and curl, like smoke being pulled back into a bottle. And Lura screamed and reached out, but Sam held her tight and said, "She is saving you. She is saving us all." Then there was nothing, no sound, no light, no wind, just snow again, falling gently, like it had never stopped. The shape in the sky was gone, and the trees stood still again, and the stars returned without fear. And Sam looked up with tears in his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." And Lura sat beside him with her head in her hands and her shoulders shaking, but she made no sounding. The morning, the agents found them walking out of the forest, hand in hand, one man and one child with eyes full of things too big for words. And Keller stepped forward and asked what happened, and Sam said, "She made a choice, and now it is our turn to choose what kind of people we want to be." Town never spoke of what happened, and the machines were taken away, and the forest was marked as off limits, and the sky never glowed like that again. But some nights the stars seemed to move a little slower, and the wind whispered a name that only Lura could understand. Sam built a new home at the edge of the trees where the light had once touched the ground, and he raised Lura like his own, and she grew strong and kind and quiet. And every evening she stood at the fence and looked up and waited, not for rescue, but for memory to pass by like a soft wind. Years later, people would ask her what really happened that winter, and she would smile and say, "We were saved by someone who only asked for a warm meal and gave us everything instead." And when she said those words, the fire in her eyes never faded, and the world around her always seemed just a little more peaceful, just a little more human.